In the mean, welcome everyone. A few announcements before we start today's event. There will be a CLE. It is, I can bring it closer. There will be a CLE event registration circulating in the room. If you would like CLE credits, the organizers have asked that you please ensure you sign and include your name on the sheet that will be circulating. But without any further ado, I'm really pleased to start today's event. Welcome. My name is Megan Mannion, and I am the research director at the Global Gender Equality Project at Yale Law School. I'm also the clinical lecturer in law for the International Human Rights Clinic. I'm really pleased to be here moderating today's event with some really spectacular panelists, both from Afghanistan and working on international justice issues and justice for women's rights in Afghanistan on multiple levels. So we have a really packed agenda, and I'm going to not waste time, too much time giving an introduction, but the panelists do warrant an introduction. We have Mitra Mehran, who's an advisor to the End Gender Apartheid campaign. Mitra is a gender equity and human rights activist and practitioner with a decade of experience in international development, peace, and gender equality. Due to the challenge posed by the Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan, Mitra now resides in exile, advocating for the recognition of gender apartheid. Her efforts include mobilizing international action and contributing to legal advocacy initiatives, as well as monitoring and documenting the Taliban's decrees curtailing women's rights. We are also joined today by Mohammed Musa Mahmoudi. Musa is a research fellow and colleague of mine, research fellow in law at the Shell Center for International Human Rights at Yale Law School. His research and work focuses on accountability, transitional justice, victims' participation in criminal proceedings, justice reform, and minority rights. Before coming to Yale, Musa had a very accomplished legal career as a human rights defender and lawyer based in Kabul, Afghanistan. He served as an executive director of the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission for 10 years, providing strategic direction for programs and activities to monitor, protect, and promote human rights in conflict in the country. We are also joined by Natasha Armpriester, who is a senior legal counsel at the Open Society Justice Initiative, where she specializes in using strategic litigation to address complex human rights legal issues. Natasha represents clients before domestic and international criminal courts, including national Supreme Courts, the African Commission, the European Commission of Court of Human Rights, and UN treaty bodies. Natasha leads the organization's cases on Afghanistan, which we will hear about today, including one involving 3.5 billion of the Afghan state's frozen assets, and a prospective women's rights case before the ICJ. As you all know today from the background documents that were circulated in the concept note, the past year has marked significant and staggering global backlash against women's rights, and that includes many countries, but very starkly and significantly in Afghanistan. The Taliban has promulgated decrees, as we'll hear from Mitra and other panelists today, curtailing Afghan women's rights at all levels, controlling all facets of their daily lives and experiences. On the other side of this, Afghan women have been mobilizing and advocating for the international community and other actors to hold the Taliban accountable for these violations. And that has included advocacy before UN treaty bodies, special procedures mechanisms, and the International Criminal Court and in other foreign jurisdictions. So we really have a dynamic panel here today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from each of my colleagues who've joined us. So I'd like to start with you, Mitra. You've often noted that the concept of gender apartheid is one thing that the majority of women in Afghanistan agree on, both inside and outside the country. Can you tell us a little bit more about this call to end gender apartheid, but also to recognize and codify gender apartheid as a crime against humanity? You could use this.
I think, okay, yeah, good. Thank you so much for having me today, and I'm humbled to be here with everyone this afternoon. As you may all know, Afghanistan is struggling with as UN put it, an unprecedented women's rights and human rights crisis. And it's not the first time. Women of Afghanistan had this experience, lived gender apartheid of the Taliban between 1996 to 2001. And the question we often ask is, what if it was codified and named and recognized for what it is? Then would we be facing and struggling with it now? So when the Taliban took power in August 2021, the first reaction from women of Afghanistan in explaining and describing their experience or communicating it with the international community on how to frame it, a language that people could understand, was calling the situation gender apartheid. And then when I started digging deeper and I talked and consulted with women in remote areas and rural areas, they even didn't know that it is not a law yet. They didn't know it's not codified. And meantime, of course, women in Iran was describing their experience as gender apartheid. That's why the End Gender Apartheid campaign came out. It was the main aim is how we can amplify the voices from inside Afghanistan and how we can communicate that with the international community to effectively, within the framework of international law, respond to it. But the reason is, one thing is, yes, women of Afghanistan resonate with this terminology, but I want to say why. Because the gender-based discrimination, it's not just any gender-based discrimination. The atrocities and dehumanization Taliban are perpetrating against women and girls inside Afghanistan is not a cultural or social act. It's not perpetrated by an individual or a group. It's a systematic and institutionalized regime of the Taliban that use law and policies that they call it decrees to discriminate women, subjugate them and oppress them, and ensure that Afghanistan is a society where men in the state are dominant over the women in that community. So now, why we say that? Taliban took power in August 2021, and they have issued 185 decrees so far, out of which 98 of those decrees, which is the Taliban's laws, directly target, restrict, or introduce control mechanisms against women. It started with right to education, and then employment, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, bodily autonomy. And then just last month, we had the Taliban Minister of Vice and Virtue framework came out that even criminalized the very face and voices of women. So as a woman from Afghanistan, now me talking with that many men in the room listening to me, if I was inside Afghanistan, I would be arbitrarily arrested, imprisoned, and tortured, because my voice as a woman is a crime. And then it's not just these decrees. So they have these mechanisms that violently enforce these decrees. The main one is Minister of Vice and Virtue. The Taliban soldiers, they call it muhtasibin based on the new framework, how they define it. They are authorized very vaguely. They say if as a soldier on the street anywhere, if they see a woman, for example, who is out for groceries, if they see a woman who is sick, trying to take herself or her kid to the hospital, the Taliban soldiers are authorized to arbitrarily arrest her and imprison her and subject her to any time period of imprisonment if he feels that she is not abiding by one of the Taliban's laws. And we see that every day on the streets of Kabul. So that's why it is important for women of Afghanistan to call their situation, their experience, gender apartheid. And I always say that I am honestly in awe of how much tolerance the world has for misogyny and patriarchy and the violation and gender discrimination. Because when I see that the world is not in agony and not crazy about it, I'm like, there is a law saying in Afghanistan that the girls cannot go to school. And also it's here that we see how much international law need to be empowered, because for me, case of Afghanistan is not only about women's rights in Afghanistan. I think it's a regress to more than 60, 70 years of fights of all women around the world for gender justice. Because if that's normalized there, that can be normalized anywhere else in the world. So that's why women of Afghanistan is calling for the international solidarity, and how what they are asking is, we can discuss later how all other mechanisms to be used. And one of the main things they have been asking is codification of gender apartheid. And we think that the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty draft, which is under consideration in the Legal Committee of UN, is a good and close opportunity for us to consider this process.
Thank you, Mitra. I think just on my own behalf, I'm always struck by the research you're doing and how important it is, particularly as you highlight the institutionalization feature of what's happening in Afghanistan, and how that has plays into the need to codify a particular crime as a crime against humanity of gender apartheid. I'm going to turn and tie this discussion about sort of the tolerance of the international community for the type of patriarchy and discrimination against women and girls that we're seeing to a question to my colleague Musa, sort of about the legacy of accountability in Afghanistan. And as you know, Musa, in November of 2017, the ICC prosecutor requested authorization to open an investigation into crimes committed since May 2003. We all know that in March of 2020, the prosecutor was authorized to open an investigation, and yet there has not been any concrete action from the court since then. As we see the situation in Afghanistan deteriorating, particularly for women's rights, as Mitra has just outlined, could you tell us a little bit about the importance of the ICC and its role now, and what your hopes might be for its future actions?
Thank you, Megan. I'm really privileged to speak and address this session. Let me take everyone back a little bit to 2003, when Afghanistan signed and acceded to the ICC. At the time, Afghanistan was very new out of the first period of Taliban rule. We didn't have any legal frameworks other than a Bonn agreement that was providing for establishment of Afghanistan government, for judiciary. We didn't have any law enforcement in place. So everything, Afghanistan as a state was in its weakest form and state. And the reason why Afghanistan signed the ICC and became a member, because Afghanistan witnessed, and the people of Afghanistan witnessed 3 decades of atrocities, gross human rights violations, which started with the invasion of the USSR, continued with civil war, and then the Taliban continued the atrocities and gross human rights violations, especially denying women their rights. Though Afghanistan was absent from negotiation during the 1996, 98, and 98 during this negotiation on the Rome Statute, but Afghanistan was the one situation that atrocities were happening, because 15,000 Hazaras were massacred as an ethnic group. Hundreds of villages and orchards and farmland were destroyed by the Taliban. And women were under suppression and oppression of the regime, that they didn't have the same right that they don't have right now. But because of Afghanistan's absence in that negotiation, the world failed to include something concrete to address especially the gender justice for Afghanistan. But anyway, Afghanistan willingly acceded to the ICC in 2003, to prevent the recurrence of the violence and the atrocities that it witnessed. Second, to end the impunity. And fourth, to benefit from the capacity of the international assistance to build its criminal investigation capacity. Unfortunately, for the ICC, it took very long time to start focusing on Afghanistan. And as you mentioned, it was in 2017 that the prosecutor office requested for authorization of the investigation in 2020. That authorization was approved after the first attempt that was the authorization denied. Then there was the technical issues, and this is very important to remember that some of the countries like Afghanistan sometimes became very unfortunate or become a subject of politics, the world politics that prevents the world court to do its job and mandate on that. And because of the ongoing peace negotiation in Afghanistan, and because of the international politics, that investigation did not start immediately in 2020, and it was postponed because of a request coming from the government of Afghanistan and also the then U.S. administration opposing any kind of investigation into Afghanistan situation because the ICC should have investigated crimes that were committed by all three parties, which included the Taliban, Afghanistan government, and the international coalition forces, which included the US. But now the situation is even worse because we don't have any willingness from the Taliban to investigate any crimes that are under jurisdiction of the ICC. We have a system in place that openly deny population of Afghanistan, specifically women, their basic human rights, which fall under the definition of persecution based on gender. And it is the gravity, the systematic nature of it and the widespread nature of it make it very important for the ICC to step in and to start investigating these crimes in Afghanistan. And now, as Mitra mentioned, it is evident that women are deprived of their rights to education, rights to employment. Even they cannot go out and their voices is a kind of crime when they want to speak out in the outside. And the recent law on promotion of virtue and prevention of vice made it more restrictive for women even to go out for the provision of the necessary commodities outside their houses. So we also had in the past 3 years the failure of the Taliban to protect women. The women were attacked in different areas. For example, on 31st of September 2022, the Koch educational institutions were attacked and over 49 girl children were killed. Attacks on different education centers, different cultural centers took place. The Taliban could not investigate cases of murdering women. From 2021 until now, 281 women were killed in Afghanistan. They were human rights activists. They were civil activists. They were former employees of the national governments or the national security forces. And hundreds of women, because they protested and demonstrated against the oppressive Taliban regime, against curtailing their rights, they were arrested, detained, sexually abused, and defamed in Afghanistan. So these all fall in the categories of the gender-based violence and the crimes of persecution that is under jurisdiction of the ICC. In addition to that, and I think Mitra is very right to call for a new category of international crime, because we need to bring the attention of the world to the severity and gravity of the crimes that are happening in Afghanistan and also in the other part of the world. And that is category of crime is gender apartheid, because it is a within the regime, in the context of regime of institutionalized oppression and excluding women and one group of gender dominate over the other gender for the benefit of that, and exclude the other genders from the public life. And these are inhuman acts, and we have seen the international experts, international organizations, international legal scholars calling this situation gender apartheid, because it, as one of the scholars mentioned, that's the immediate benefit of recognizing gender apartheid as a crime is to prevent the international community to engage with the Taliban as a government, because there is a genuine fear in Afghanistan that the Taliban is going to be recognized as a government, and the international community is going to live with the Taliban oppressing women and girls, denying their basic human rights. So the ICC remain one of the vehicles, one of the means that the Afghanistan victims, Afghanistan human rights defenders, Afghanistan human rights activists could turn to use them, because when we became a party to the ICC, we should benefit from the ICC, and now is the time that the ICC should do that. And of course, we are aware of the slow pace of the ICC's investigation, the restraint and the restrictions on resources, and the challenges that they face in investigating cases of crimes against humanity, war crime in Afghanistan. But we call for the international community, for the ICC to pay attention to Afghanistan, because it is 3 years that 2 million women are deprived of going to school. It is 3 years that millions of families who have a woman as breadwinners or women contributed significantly to their economy, and they are deprived of their incomes, and they become poor. And it contributed to the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan that we face. So the ICC could play a role, bring the individuals who are, and the command structure of the Taliban were imposing this gender apartheid regime in Afghanistan, and also committing the crimes of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Musa. I'm actually particularly struck by how you raised sort of the obligations of the Taliban as the de facto authorities to take positive steps to protect women's rights, and sort of the ways in which you would think of a government as obligated to do that under international human rights law, from domestic violence and other types of issues. So I really appreciate that you raised that angle, in addition to the decades-long complexity of international politics around accountability in the country. I think that brings us actually quite smoothly into my question I have for you, Natasha, which is also around the dimensions of the role for the international community in seeking accountability in Afghanistan. And I think for those of us, and I'm sure many of you in the room who work on women's human rights issues, we know that there's often a lot of lamenting about violations of women's rights internationally, but often not a lot of action. And during the General Assembly this year, we know that Australia, Canada, Germany, and the Netherlands have informed the international community of initial steps that could potentially result in a case at the ICJ under the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. This is central to your work. I know you've been leading efforts on this. Could you tell us more about what's happening with this potential case and how it could sort of benefit accountability in Afghanistan, short and long term?
Sure. Megan, thank you. Mitra, Musa, it's always a pleasure and very moving to hear you both speak. So thank you for that, and I'm humbled to be here. Yeah, sure. It was quite an announcement that was made. For those who are unfamiliar with the ICJ process, I'll talk a little bit about it. But the situation in Afghanistan was very well described. We have a total subjugation of half the population, and just this blanket discrimination that's happening to women. And we have this convention, like Megan said, the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And if there's any situation right in the world that this convention should be covering, I think Afghanistan's the most ripe example for that. And so sometimes, as Musa was explaining, like criminal accountability doesn't always do the job that we want it to do. And it doesn't always fit so nicely into a situation like this, like a situation of a gender apartheid that's happening. And we have this entire regime, right, the state-run process, really suppressing half the population. And so when we're talking about state accountability and state responsibility, we can look to international human rights law to see what might be done in that realm. So I really think, like I said, the quintessential most plain case for a CEDAW process is really Afghanistan. So CEDAW, like its sister International Human Rights Treaty, CERD, CAT, they have this process of an avenue for justice before the International Court of Justice. And it is a place where you can really take state responsibility for the violations within these three conventions. And given we're dealing here with an entire state that's perpetrating this blanket system of discrimination against all its women, it seems like a very appropriate time to activate. CEDAW's never, ever been litigated before the International Court of Justice. CAT has, CERD has, CEDAW is the one that has not. So a case like this would be groundbreaking. It could set some really new precedent in international law. So like you kindly mentioned, my colleagues and I, my colleague Genevieve's in the room with me, we've been working on this case, trying to push states to really use this avenue for justice. We've seen the ICJ used recently. I think last night's panel, which sadly I was not there for, talked a lot about how the ICJ has been used to empower the powerless. We see it being used in Gaza. We see it being used in Myanmar, Syria. So I think it's high time it's used in Afghanistan. And so we were concerned. We've been working on this since October 2021. We've been seeing this normalization of the Taliban and getting very concerned that the Taliban is attempting more and more to legitimize itself. To really control the negotiations that are happening, right? We saw the Doha talks, which some people are probably familiar with, where the Taliban is being able to put its own parameters on things and put these caveats out that the international community is caving to, right? No women can be at the table. Now we're not going to have civil society there. So trying to find a way in which something big can happen in international space that isn't going to be a way that appeases the Taliban and what they want and really brings them to task. So we were pleased when we saw the 4 countries announce that they were pursuing this path. There are 22 other countries around the world that announced that they're supporting this. So Chile, Iceland, Slovenia, Honduras, Morocco, a lot of different states around the world are really supporting this effort. And we'll see if some of those states eventually maybe join this effort, because that's still a possibility. And we can talk a bit more about the procedure. It was actually a month ago today that they announced that. So here we are. And what we've been doing additionally is working with Afghans inside the country and outside the country to hopefully really inform this process, right? Oftentimes it is a state-run process. It isn't a formal process for civil society or the affected community, but there are ways that states can really get both involved into the process and make it a more authentic process. So that's something that we've been hoping to prioritize and working with Afghan colleagues to do that. So for those unfamiliar with the ICJ process, I'll do like a 30-second review real fast on that. So the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, it's our world court. They hear state-to-state complaints. So I can't bring a case, Mitra can't bring a case, unfortunately, but states can. So we really rely on states to invoke state responsibility before the court on behalf of those that are not being treated right by the states that they live within. And so in CEDAW, there's an Article 29, which has a jurisdictional clause that allows a state parties to the treaty to bring their dispute before the International Court of Justice to settle any sort of disagreement about the application of the treaty, which I think we have a wholesale application problem happening in Afghanistan, as well as the interpretation of the treaty. And as Megan mentioned, you know, it is a state-run process. And so because the treaty obligations follow the state, it's not any particular regime in power, Afghanistan's still bound by the obligations of CEDAW. And so when we look at our draft articles of state responsibility, whether it's a government that is illegitimate, a de facto government, a de jure government, they still are liable for the obligations of the state, right? It follows the state, the obligations. So you asked about short-term impacts, long-term impacts. Short-term impacts. So I think, you know, Mitra put it really well. The international community has failed Afghanistan, and particularly failed the women of Afghanistan. And there's this feeling, I believe, that we've heard, you know, about feeling ignored, feeling dismissed, and really feeling defied. And being left out. So I think a case like this kind of reminds the world of what's happening to the women and girls in Afghanistan, and also acknowledges what's happening. You know, I think also this act of filing a case sends a message to the de facto authorities that, you know, in this climate of normalization, in this climate of, you know, legitimization, this thawing of relationships we're seeing, concessions can't be made anymore, and this is serious. Like, you are not a proper player in the international world order, and this is a way to call that to task. I think, Musa, you mentioned it, you know, recognition is something that the Taliban wants badly. And it's probably the biggest stick, I think, that the international community still has as leverage on the Taliban. So I think filing a case like this helps demonstrate that the government is not abiding by international law. It doesn't meet the criteria to be a legitimate authority. So I think it's another reminder to states that might be, you know, accepting ambassadors now from the Taliban, or changing the embassy that, hey, listen, this is what you're dealing with. It also lays a legal foundation. So when this announcement was made, we started to see a lot of articles come out. You start to see journalists, you see documentation coming out, you see people wanting to do more and seeing like, okay, maybe there's something that the documentation I'm doing, the work I'm doing can actually feed into it. So I think it's a way to make that a little bit more robust. And I think it also serves as like an elevated warning to other countries that might be complicit. This is something that I think we're seeing in the South Africa-Israel case, right? Where we start seeing like, oh, wait, there's a judgment coming out. Maybe I need to be a little bit more careful about the weapons I'm supplying to a violating state. So I think it also in the short term kind of raises a red flag to other countries. The big one, which I probably should have led with, is something called preliminary measures or provisional measures that the International Court of Justice can issue in a case. And this is something that these cases can take a really long time. I think, as most people here know, around 7 years, 15 years sometimes. We hope that would not be the case here. But there are these little mini judgments, I like to call them, that the ICJ can issue, which are provisional measures. And basically what those are is to halt irreparable harm that are happening in the country and issue like, you know, this just stop until we can make a final judgment. This is really critical. We've seen this happen in Ukraine v. Russia. We've seen this in Israel again v. South Africa. Canada has, and Netherlands have a case against Syria. And these can happen really fast, a matter of weeks, right? This is not something we usually see in the international justice space. I mean, ICC, right? Decades we're waiting for something, but it is something that can happen in a matter of weeks to a couple of months. And can happen multiple times, right? South Africa continues to ask for preliminary measures. I don't know if the court loves that, but that is something that's something they can do and continue asking. So yeah, that's another short-term impact. And we'll talk a little bit more, maybe I think someone will probably ask about compliance and enforcement. There is that possibility at the UN Security Council. As soon as a preliminary measure is issued, the Security Council is notified of that, and they do have the power of enforcement. they don't use it, but they do have it. So that's another one. In terms of long-term impacts, like I said, this is a really long process. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. It kind of keeps Afghanistan on the agenda. Any contentious cases that are before the ICJ have to be reported to the UN Security Council. Preliminary measures, again, are reported, implementations reported. So it kind of keeps that on the agenda. Anytime we have a hearing, it's back on the agenda. I think we've seen in other cases, all of a sudden the media is covering when there's a hearing. So it helps just keep the spotlight on a situation that is unfortunately overshadowed due to the sad nature of our world right now with everything happening around the world. Sometimes people just don't pay attention. So I think it's helpful for that. So where are we, the current status? I'll wrap up here, just kind of letting know where people are. So yes, a month ago today, the 4 states announced that they were going to undertake the dispute settlement process, which basically was they just sent a note to the de facto authorities saying we have a dispute with you under CETA. Let's negotiate. Let's discuss this. Let's try and resolve our dispute. Otherwise, we're going to have to go to the International Court of Justice. So that's kind of where we stand. So we'll see. Hopefully the states do it, unless the Taliban get their act together. But we can talk a bit more about the procedure on that.
Thank you, Natasha. And yeah, I think in terms of your wrap up, what's exciting about this is sort of the increased and consistent momentum that the potential for this process, even if it is a long process, has to sort of involve many states and also keep the pressure on Afghanistan. So I think it's really important that you're here to highlight that. We've also seen it, for example, in the 6th committee meeting on the Crimes Against Humanity draft convention. So I'm cognizant that each of you have discussed sort of 3 different pathways and 3 different ways in which we're keeping Afghanistan gender justice and women's rights on the agenda. I think we've seen in sort of the context of international pressure, domestic pressure on solving some of these issues, advocacy from states that, we have limited bandwidth. There's a lot happening in the world. There are a lot of international human rights issues to tackle. There are other conflicts, and we have to sort of focus on one thing at a time. So I'd be interested to hear from you each. How you reconcile this, sort of how you perhaps advocate with states, sort of why and for what end they need to simultaneously commit and address each of these pathways, and sort of what you see as the benefit to addressing these in tandem. If anyone would like to go first, otherwise I can start with you, Mitra, if you don't mind.
So because of the intensity of the situation in Afghanistan and the atrocities Taliban are committing against women and girls, it's in the totalizing nature of the operation Taliban are perpetrating against women and against people of Afghanistan in general needs and requires all existing mechanisms to be utilized. And we don't see any of the existing mechanisms in competition with each other. So as an advocate that with my sisters from Afghanistan and also, of course, in solidarity with international friends like Natasha and my colleagues at Amnesty, Atlantic Council, and everyone that we work with is how we see that all of these mechanisms are complementary to each other. Because, for example, yes, we do a lot of state engagements for codification of gender apartheid in the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty. But how we see it is how bringing case to ICJ actually highlight the situation of Afghanistan that can also push these states to start having this conversation on that issue. Or case of ICC, for example, for documentation and investigation, for instance, financial resources has been a big issue. How the case of Afghanistan being highlighted more, or if it makes it to bigger, headlines and bigger media outlets, or if there is more conversation among civil society and also public in different countries, how it can also encourage different states to support the ICC financially, for example. Even if, for example, for me, some of the countries that we knew they are not gonna take, because I see Ambassador Beth here, for example, if we don't see US potentially not doing anything with ICC, but how we can encourage through its civil society to financially support ICC to do more investigation on case of Afghanistan. So I think, and the other thing is women of Afghanistan are resisting inside the country, taking risk with their lives. I mean, when they go to street, they face gunshots, pepper sprays, arbitrary arrests. We have imprisonment and torture. Their families are threatened. And there is no justice system in Afghanistan that we rely on. So we have to, the only reason that we have put our full potential as activists and advocates in exile or in diaspora, if people affiliate themselves that way, on international legal mechanisms, is because we don't have anything else in Afghanistan to hold on to. And that's why in any mechanism that can complement each other by responding to the situation in short term or in long term, that is beneficial for us. For example, I attended the Doha Second as one of the civil society representatives, and we saw how the world shockingly abide by the Taliban rules and agreed not to have women on the table, not to have civil society, but also not to have women's rights on the agenda. So there was nothing. But for example, with gender apartheid, we definitely cannot respond to that very soon, while with ICJ we can, or with other special procedures, or if we can push, for example, Richard Bennett mandate, the special rapporteur for Afghanistan, hopefully to be more influential and included in the Doha process. So we see all of them complementary with each other, and that is necessary thing to remember. And none of them are in competition with each other, because their area of operation is kind of different too. And we, for example, there are more resources if all of them are activated, and hopefully that can create that potential for the global solidarity we need at this point. Because in the past 3 years, what we are truly missing is, at some point, maybe not the frameworks, not the mechanisms, but it's the political will. Because the countries wouldn't meet you, the countries wouldn't respond to you. They're comfortable to go and meet with the Taliban in Kabul than to meet me, for example, here in New York. Believe me if I say that there are countries who don't want to meet us, but they pave red carpets for the Taliban and take pride in meeting them. So I think all of them are like complementary to each other and necessary to be used and leveraged and utilized as soon as we can.
Thank you. I concur with Mitra on this, and also emphasize on the ICC rule, because ICC has a firm belief. I think the prosecutor, as it was stated in the statement, that the crimes under jurisdiction of the ICC were committed in Afghanistan and are being committed in Afghanistan, and there is no mechanism internally available to prosecute or investigate those crimes. So this brings the responsibility to the ICC to investigate and prosecute those crimes and the perpetrators. And because the international criminal mechanism is focusing on individuals, we hope that as the ICC managed to put arrest warrant against perpetrators like Vladimir Putin and others, head of states, we see this, issuance of arrest warrants against Mullah Haibatullah, and his brass in the Taliban, because they are openly and publicly stating, their enforcement of the crimes that they are committing in Afghanistan, and acknowledging that. And recently, you probably have heard, and many of us heard that and documented that the Taliban leader himself acknowledged that the prisoners were killed by the Taliban in prison and in mass numbers. So this kind of atrocities not only against women, but tortures, extrajudicial killing, ethnic cleansing, displacement, deportation is happening in Afghanistan, and commitment, and they are committing war crimes in Afghanistan. So the ICC have the jurisdiction now, but it is the matter of, the technical issues, how to investigate, and of course we are aware of that, how to get the documentation and witnesses, and prepare the resources for that. And I think there is a way on for that, and that way could be to work with the Afghanistan civil society and human rights groups. They could facilitate, as we facilitated in 2018, by organizing and facilitating to submit the victim consent forms to the ICC. So that could be done, identifying the victims and reviewing that. And then the other issue I think that we have to advocate, and we are doing that, is that to advocate before the states to use their universal jurisdiction power, because that's something that's could be used against the individuals who are denying human rights of women in Afghanistan and committing human rights violations, and also these atrocities. I think that's a very strong tools that that could be utilized by the international community in the absence of the, when the ICC is slow to proceed with its investigation. And of course, the ICG is also another venue under CEDA. Afghanistan did not place any reservation on the CEDA, and Article 29 of CEDA allows that the states could bring the case of CEDA before the ICG. And of course, there are some issues that raised at the beginning a concern that how this would allow engagement with the Taliban because of the period of engagement with the Taliban, and also the arbitration and the appearance of the Taliban representing Afghanistan state. This is something that we always fear and do not want to happen, because the Taliban are not legitimately in power. They negated all the international calls and resolutions, and they openly and publicly, systematically and widespreadly violating human rights of Afghans. And it's hard to submit to the Taliban atrocities and gross human rights violation, as did the UN, unfortunately, in the end of June this year, when, despite the call from Afghan civil society, Afghan women, to include women and civil society in that process, they did not, and they just submitted and surrendered to the Taliban request of removing those groups from that. And also, we are working on documentation of these gross human rights violations in Afghanistan and daily abuses of human rights of Afghan population, women from different part of the country. And it struck me that's how the world has not been aware of the everyday human rights violations that going on in every corner of Afghanistan. And I think that's something that we have to bring, and that also requires a lot of resources and a lot of risks that we have to take in order to bring those issues to the light. And then the sanction regime. I think that there is a tendency within the international community to weaken the sanction regime. We see that, yesterday, I think many of you might have seen the big picture of Haqqani, the notorious criminal in the world, that he was portrayed as a potential for change in Afghanistan, as a hope for change in Afghanistan. And I was struck that how it was, first allowed some years ago that the same group publish an opinion in the most prestigious media outlet in the world, and now that's bring up against as an alternative to the Taliban. I think we cannot replace bad with bad, worse with worst. I think we need a legal, legitimate path, as we want for every other country, every other situation to be applied in Afghanistan equally. Of course, we can fall under category of the third world country. Some people might say that a tribal, country, but still we are human and we deserve, our dignity and human, and it cannot be treated as, okay, you can live with the Taliban because you are Afghanistan. And I hope that that's not the, kind of understanding that the international community make about Afghanistan. And I hope that they see that the 20 years of Afghans cooperating with the international community, going to schools, participating in election, despite the threats of Taliban and mutilating their hands and their fingers. They went to cast their votes, building civil society, building a free economy, aspiring for freedom. It should be, a common ground for the international community to come to the rescue of Afghan people and exhaust all the international mechanisms that are available to hold the Taliban accountable and to alleviate the pain and sufferings of Afghan people.
Thanks, Musa. Thanks, Mitra. Yeah, I think, Mitra explained the complementarity. I think they are really mutually reinforcing processes. I mean, in terms of the resource question, I sometimes feel like states, and sorry if states are in the room, kind of use it as a cop-out. I think it's not so much a resource of time and money, but the resource really is political interest and political will to do something. Some of these processes we're talking about, right, they can't really participate in, and some they can. We have Germany and Netherlands thinking of taking the case to the ICJ. Well, maybe some funding goes to the ICC, but it's not necessarily their resources going to that in that same way. So I think we can chew gum and walk at the same time. Criminal accountability, we have that threat, right? It's really a palpable feeling, but it takes a long time. We, like was mentioned, there's sanctions, there's travel bans. A lot of the countries that we might want to exercise universal jurisdiction, or we might want to arrest someone in the Taliban, they're not traveling right now. So sometimes we need to look to other types of avenues. Sorry, I'll keep going to the ICJ because I think that's why I'm here. But then we have that option in those situations to use that while we kind of wait for the ICC process, the UJ process to move forward. But I think the decisions from the ICC or from UJ or from the Security Council or coming out of the Human Rights Council or coming out of the ICJ really can reinforce one another, including the evidence and the record that comes out, right? And evidence that's built or the record that comes out of an ICJ case is going to be really helpful for the codification of gender apartheid to show the real systematic situation that's happening. It can be used also as evidence in a criminal investigation or a criminal conviction, showing really what the command structure was, what was going on, and all the different violations that took place. So just to go on to the codification of gender apartheid quickly, we're talking about a criminal process, but I think the ICJ can be really instrumental in that way. One, for the reason that I shared, but also Mitra touched on it, which was, the advocacy and intention that a case like that will get, and really show states, listen, we have 4 states or maybe more pushing this forward. Other states, you can do something too and really push the codification process forward. And there are ways, and there's been an example, there is a professor that's been working closely with Mitra and others, Professor Karima Badoun, who's been working on gender apartheid, that uses this example of forced pregnancy, showing that, forced pregnancy, there was other ways to kind of address it, but it wasn't its own crime. And it was really the trials, the ICTY, the ICTR trials of what was happening in Bosnia and Rwanda, that states were like, oh, wait, we should probably make forced pregnancy a crime. So different processes like that can kind of lead to this codification process and help support in different ways. Our dear friend, Richard Bennett, the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan, has called for an all tools approach. So it's kind of been like this catchphrase that people use. Let's use all the tools, right? Like, why not? It's happening, like I said, in the Ukraine. It's happening for Syria. It's happening for Myanmar. There's ICJ cases for all of those. There's independent mechanisms actually for all those, which Afghanistan doesn't yet have, but a lot of folks are calling for it. There's a special rapporteur. You know, there's commissions inquiry, there's all these different things. So the resource question, I kind of laugh at because I'm like, it's possible, right? It's possible if you want it to happen. And yeah, I mean, there's other processes. You mentioned sanctions. Afghanistan's up for CEDAW review actually this year. The Special Rapporteur has an accountability component to his mandate. I think maybe folks probably saw out of the European Court of Justice. They just put a ruling out that nationality and gender can be a basis for asylum. So, you know, that in itself is a really good precedent that can be used in other things. So yeah, I think that's all I'd say. I have a lot of passion behind using all the tools because I think it's possible.
Thank you. Thanks to each of you for addressing that question. I think it's really important and timely, especially as the momentum is building on each of these issues. I do have more questions for you, but I want to give others an opportunity to ask questions of the panelists. We have about 14 minutes for questions. So the floor is open. If you would mind, you could introduce yourself, and if you have a particular panelist you'd like to direct your question to, please let us know, please. We have
Thank you so much for this panel, and especially to the panelists. I'm in awe of you two particularly. Sorry, Stephanie Ferrier. I think among the most frustrating things is the failure of the international community at large to really act, and we know that they could act and they're not acting. The reason that the apartheid framework is so important is we saw when racial apartheid was being challenged in South Africa, it really was the international community's pressure, and we know it took a long time, but there was a concerted effort to change the system, to end the system. And so that's why it's important for this framework to be used, I think, in this setting as well, because everything else has failed, quite honestly, right? But what's so sad is that people aren't really coming together. The so-called constructive engagement that states use, some of them, including the one we're in right now, for dealing with the South African apartheid government, is being used by many states here. Oh, we have to engage with them, and then maybe it'll change. So, you know, they're engaged with, and then they issue yet one more, an additional. They keep adding these incredible restrictions. And the UN itself isn't helping because, like, for example, the UN Human Rights Committee last reviewed Afghanistan in 1985. And they kept postponing the next review, postponing. I guess you're hearing my frustration, which I can't believe is even amounts to what your frustration must be. So I think it's fabulous this case was filed in the ICJ. I mean, we keep looking at other mechanisms, trying to use all of them. But maybe one thing to do, and I don't know to what extent it's been done, is to maybe educate. I mean, so the states are fully aware, they're educated about the restrictive laws that are in place and what's happening to women and girls. But, you know, one hears, oh, but we have to engage because we have to make sure that the humanitarian assistance reaches people and so forth. But then what I've been hearing is, oh, the humanitarian assistance actually is only reaching the areas in Afghanistan that are allied with the Taliban anyway. So maybe that kind of, I don't know what will work. I'm sorry to put it, I guess it's an open, just throwing it out question. It's.
Thank you. Maybe I can just sort of bridge a little bit the issue you raised that I don't think we've had a chance to address. And I know maybe the panelists want to speak to this, but we also have sort of a corresponding humanitarian situation for women and girls in the country, and sort of its impact on some of the issues that are coming up in the context of either the crimes against humanity or criminal accountability. Is humanitarian assistance and the situation for women and girls in that regard featuring in any of your work?
So yes, humanitarian aid is very important because around 23 million people in Afghanistan rely on that. But what we are asking for is principled humanitarian aid, respecting, of course, the unconditionality principle of it, because what's happening is unfortunately, UN is even violating its own principles in sending and distributing that. The reason is maybe UN feels it's because what's happening is the money for humanitarian aid is sent in cash. It's distributed, it's managed heavily under influence of the Taliban. So it doesn't go to anyone else in Afghanistan, but majority of it goes to the Taliban soldiers. And then there is a SIGA report showing how much the Taliban in different ways gain from that money, from the actual cash. And then how, there is corruption in that process. And there is no gender sensitive monitoring mechanism for the distribution of humanitarian aid. So one of the things that we think these mechanisms can help is how we can push United Nations to actually make its engagement, at least on the humanitarian aid space, more principled. That is totally not the case, unfortunately, now.
I think the one thing that is very important to understand in Afghanistan, that people are, suffering immensely under the Taliban, and that Taliban ruling in Afghanistan perpetuated the humanitarian situation and caused it, and it is not something else, and we should understand that one. And Taliban has designed that system to oppress people and to keep the cash flow coming in so they can benefit from it. And unfortunately, there is very little that the international community can do to improve it. And that situation so far has not helped Afghan population. It has not improved the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. It worsened. And it, in terms of gender and vulnerable people like women, like minority groups, like children, they have remained disadvantaged in receiving, as a recipient of the humanitarian assistance and aid. Women cannot work effectively to have a role in distribution of the humanitarian aid. And then there is no monitoring, as Mitra mentioned, monitoring mechanism to see this, how this impacts the daily life of the woman. We know that the reproductive health of women has deteriorated because of the Taliban policy and because of the Taliban situation. Malnutrition has spread. More women are food insecure than before now. So these are the signs that we can see, and that unfortunately this is because of the designed humanitarian aid programs in Afghanistan. And then it's very contradictory, to be honest, that many of these international organizations are complying with the Taliban's policies when they are in Afghanistan. And it hurts me that some of the institutions, they comply with the Taliban, not allowing their Afghan female workers. Of course, there are international female workers in Afghanistan, but Afghan female workers to have a role. And this is something that contradicts, which policy should be prioritized, the international guidelines, the international policies and standards and principles, or the Taliban's rules and regulations. And I think that's something that perpetuates the situation and worsen the human rights situation and embolden Taliban further to restrict women's rights. As it is apparent after the Doha conference, the Taliban came up with the law on promotion of virtue and prevention of vice, which restricted way further, the human rights of Afghan population, specifically women.
Thank you. We have a number of other questions, so please, I think in the order they were received. And if I can just ask, because we have a number of hands in the room, just 1 to 2 minutes for the question to the panel. Thank you.
Yeah, it actually kind of echoes the first question. A specific thing came to mind. So I'm a student at the University of Toronto. I'm actually currently working with a lot of students, including the former ombudsman to Afghanistan, who actually fled the Taliban in 2021 and is now a resident scholar at the University of Toronto. So she's trying to bring in her insights on how we can contribute kind of to the ICJ case and pressuring countries to essentially assume obligations towards these women and children. So I guess my question is around, is there kind of precedent for countries to have extraterritorial obligations when it comes to protecting these rights? Because I think, something like the UN Security Council resolution on women, peace, and security comes to mind, where countries are, agreeing to these frameworks, agreeing to this understanding that there are these obligations to protect these human rights, but ultimately, is there precedent really enough to kind of hold countries accountable to that and say, in your feminist foreign policies, in the way that you make decisions, how do you really inherently protect these women? And does that come from, delegitimizing the Taliban as a government? Like how would we kind of, as an international community, maybe put pressure on countries to really assume the obligations that they're taking on?
Yeah, I think let's collect one more question. How many more hands do we have? Okay, we have 1, 2, and then I think we might need to see where we're at. Straight back in the row. I saw that hand.
Hi, everyone. My name is Huda. So I had a question about, I was wondering if, because CEDAW had maybe most of the reservations by all the states, why this is a factor, why the international community at large is hesitant to bring about more pressure. And if it is a factor, I wanted to ask, how can we combat that, especially that the justifications for the reservations are mainly for traditions, cultures, and religious regions.
And then just behind you. Yep, great, thanks.
My question might be a little bit jumping from this one as well. If we're using an all tools approach, are we using Islamic law to put pressure? Because that's the only legal regime that this group abides by. And I love international law, and I taught international law in Afghanistan, but it has no influence for the folks that we're trying to change. So I'm just wondering, I'm not an Islamic law scholar. Is anyone bringing that stick to the game?
I think we can do one more, and I saw a hand right behind her. Yes, to this gentleman.
Thanks very much. It's a very quick comment. I'm the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Geneva, legal advisor. He this morning publicly backed the call for codification of gender apartheid. It was a long internal discussion that we had at the office, but he's on the record now to back that. So just to throw that in. Thanks.
I think we'll turn back to our panelists and then come back to the room if there's time. Would anyone like to get us started? We'll work reverse order. Thanks. Thanks, Natasha.
I think it's a very big question. I'll be honest, I think there's better legal minds in the room that can answer. I don't fully know the answer to that question. I think it's a critical one. Right, for some states, their obligations are to definitely extend extraterritoriality, like they can't do certain things. For our countries, right, that have adopted a feminist foreign policy, for example, we haven't really seen that put into action, unfortunately. But I don't know fully what responsibility they have once they say something like that. But I'd like to talk with you more about this idea. And I know that I'm familiar with some of the work that Toronto's doing on this, so very excited, and thank you for that. In terms of the reservations, CEDAW is, I think, the most reserved, or has the treaty with the most reservations on it. But it is also one of the most ratified treaty, right? 90% of UN member states are members of CEDAW. In terms of cultural relativism or some of those things that they put the reservations on, they did that when they ratified. I think it was a way to get more parties, on board, but they can't always withdraw them. They can take them off. And so I think it's a matter of advocacy with whichever state you're concerned about. Afghanistan, as Musa shared, put no reservations on anything, which is really great. And the states that that said they're going to bring this case also don't have any reservations. So all of the articles are up for for grabs in a case like this. In terms of, and I'll let you all talk more about this, but I know there has been some Islamic law, some imams and other scholars that have put out different statements and so forth saying how this stuff is in violation. There was just recently something put out specifically on education. There's like near universal agreement that that is antithetical to Islam. In terms of actually using it in a case, I'm not really sure, but I have seen different special procedures bring it into their communications in that type of way. But I'll let my colleagues talk more on those.
Thank you. So I think every step of the way, especially when we engage with some states, cultural relativism is something that become an impediment. I don't see it as an impediment, but I see it more of as an excuse they give to themselves to not act when they should. They bring the issue of culture, they bring the issue of religion. But for me, as I was raised, born, and lived in Afghanistan till 2021, and millions of girls like me went to school and university, and hundreds of thousands were working in different sectors. So if it was really them in culture in Afghanistan, where I came from, are millions like me who are now imprisoned basically inside Afghanistan. And that's why I think, yes, there are these mechanisms and laws we talked about. They need to be recognized and specifically called for the context of Afghanistan. So in the face of law, then people not going to be use culture or religion as an excuse. Islamic law is very important for us too in our discussions. I know one priority for many women inside Afghanistan was also how we can ensure that one of the countries that are part of the ICJ case is Muslim majority country or an Islamic country. And I know Natasha and her team work really hard on that and still are. And OIC has called Taliban ruling, especially on education and right to employment against Islamic law. The decrees the Taliban issued, we have analyzed it against international law, and we are in the process of finding colleagues to analyze it against Islamic and Sharia law too. And based on our initial conversation, it is actually in violation of many of the Islamic laws. I think that is one of the dominant conversation, at least in our spaces. But I am not sure how those then can be leveraged within the context of international law. But hopefully, I don't know how we can use it, except we know that will be a powerful negotiation and discussion point for us with Islamic countries. But we haven't thought how then that legally can come with certain consequences for Taliban or for the countries who, Islam makes their main religion within their own internal laws.
Just shortly on two issues. The one, if we look at the surveys conducted before Taliban in Afghanistan, and especially when you look at the sections that women were surveyed, you would see that in many surveys, including the one that we at the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission conducted, 95% of women opposed the Taliban, and these were not convenient kind of survey. We made the effort, went to the farthest part of Afghanistan, to the villages, and collected and asked this question in the local language in the most simple way possible from women. That's what do you think about a return of Taliban, about your rights to education, employment, all those rights that we thought that might be impacted by the Taliban return. At the time, we did not believe that the Taliban would return and took over all Afghanistan and control Afghanistan. We thought that if they engage in the peace process, because the peace process negotiation was going on, and when they became part of the government, what would happen to women? And so we have a data collected from across Afghanistan. So that did not show that men and women in Afghanistan opposing, the kind of rights and freedoms women are guaranteed both by Constitution of Afghanistan at the time, 2004 Constitution, the international human rights law and instruments, and also the daily practice of Afghan societies. From Kandahar, of course, because of the Taliban's attacks on schools and threatening families to not send their girl children to school, there were, few schools operating, but there was in Badakhshan, for example, that 60% of the university students were female students. So we had that diversities as well in Afghanistan. So bringing this excuse in Afghanistan that's denying women rights to education, to employment, it's according to Afghanistan culture and based on the demand of Afghan population, or it's relevant to our culture. It's, I think, something that is it's baseless from our point of view. On Islamic issue, unfortunately, the institution of the emirates that they have established, and this is something that is very controversial in Afghanistan. Now, the Taliban, I heard, and I'm not an expert on the Islamic law and jurisprudence as well, but as an Afghan lived and as a Muslim, I understand that, and I was told by some expert that one of the reason that the Kandahar people, they call it the Kandahar Taliban and Kabul Kandahar, and strangely that division is there. The Amir put this laws and regulation and restricting this law and regulation to gauge who is going to oppose this from the rank of the Taliban, so they can dismiss, or who is going to stand against it so they can crush further any opposition to the ruling of the Emir. So I don't think that, even though there are the daily practices everywhere from surrounding countries, we are surrounded by Islamic countries in that region, that the woman is still, of course, there are discrimination against women in Islamic world. We have to acknowledge that there is a form of gender apartheid against women in many other countries and around us. But the kind of the apartheid regime that Taliban are imposing is nowhere sanctioned by any Islamic scholars or any Islamic states. And in fact, it is in direct violation of the Islamic teachings, because there are Islamic tradition that encourage women to education. There are Islamic tradition that tell us about how women, at the beginning, at the start of Islam was working. And there are all sorts of, traditions there. And I think the Taliban is exploiting their authority and imposing their interpretation of Sharia. And I think that is something even in contradiction with the Islamic law. But since the Islamic, world has no one above, all, and there is no entity or institution could issue something universal fatwa, and I think this is something that is subject to exploitation by the Taliban currently in Afghanistan.
Thank you, Musa. And regretfully, we've come to time. So without any further ado, I do have to close today's event. I want to, just as a closing word, thank our three panelists. The amount of expertise and innovation and just significant work you're doing on these issues is really inspiring, and we're very grateful for the work that you're doing. Thank you.
If someone has the CLE spreadsheets and would bring those to the front, I would deeply appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for doing the microphone. I just did a call out to have someone bring it. It was floating around.